Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Enjoy your viewing. A month before he died, my grandfather sat me down at the table and began telling me stories about his childhood in Texas. As far as I knew, very little had been told about this period of my grandfather's life. Perhaps that was why what I was about to hear would make a deep impression on me. Somewhere in the vast forest that stretched between Louisiana and Paris, somewhere I dare not name, my family owned a small estate of about 150 acres. It was much larger than the rest of the land, but after several generations of living on it, we quickly ran out of room. My family had lived here since Texas became an independent state. Fights were settled between neighbors, and the law usually came with a gun. As soon as I learned how to use a gun, my father sent me out hunting. It was a time of depression and people did what they could to survive. My mom had an older brother who had been in jail twice for manufacturing alcohol. When he didn't have time for school or housework, he worked part-time to look after the distillery. The local police usually paid no attention to people's private businesses, and sometimes they did it themselves. The real nuisance for us was the tax office. Their interference sometimes deprived us of our seasonal income. As I said, during the winter months, I worked part-time to look after my uncle, who hid in a corner of the mansion. The tax collectors were always a nuisance to us, and I had to keep an eye on them and drive the curious away from their work. I was a young man of almost 12 years at the time, so even if the agents had spotted me, I could have pretended to be hunting, and they would not have paid any attention to me. With the 2 barrels of my rifle, I alerted those in the produce room to the approach of a vagrant and walked away, unaware of their fate. No one would have wanted such a bright and promising boy to go to jail. But all the cautions and warnings were in vain. One cold, foggy morning, I was walking in the neighborhood with my uncle and 2 of his friends from Clarksville. We were caught off guard by a couple of undercover agents. Because of the fog, we didn't notice them approaching until it was too late. Had we had time to prepare for their arrival, we probably could have acted less recklessly, but under the circumstances, self-defense was the priority. My uncle, who had repeatedly told us he had no intention of returning to prison, opened fire when the agents ordered us to show our hands. The gunshots really scared me. I fell to the ground and buried my face in the leaves with all my might. Suddenly, it was all over. When I tried to look up, 2 of the agents were dead, and the youngest of the Clarksville boys was only a few minutes away. My brother was doing his best to make my brother's last moments as comfortable as possible. My uncle had already taken the bodies of the agents for burial. All this was happening around me, but I couldn't utter a single clear thought or word. It must have been half an hour before I could stand up. I walked over to where my uncle was digging and he gave me a shovel. We were silent for the next hour. The ground was mostly frozen, which made the work longer and harder. We dug a hole and rolled the chemicals into it, and my brother joined us. He started digging another hole nearby, and my uncle joined him, who was going to bury the graves of the vigilantes. We took the little boy out, and together we carefully placed him in the hole and closed the lid. I don't think we said a word to each other all day. My uncle only looked at my brother, who stayed behind, nodded his head, and said goodbye. We all went our separate ways. Nothing more was said about that morning, until today. What happened that foggy morning foreshadowed our future lives. They say the boy left behind in Clarksville traveled by train until the outbreak of World War II. They say he went to Canada, joined the army, and died at Dunkirk. They say my mother's brother was a brewer until 1937 and was shot and killed during an argument over a woman. I can say that I was lucky compared to others. My mother helped me focus on my studies. The year the United States entered the war, I got my degree and was one of the first in the county to enlist in the army. Strangely enough, God was looking out for me. Although I fought for 3 years and was constantly under fire from Japanese snipers, I never ran away. After the government released me, I used the GI Bill to go to Stephen F. Austin University, and after graduation, I became a teacher. That's where I met your grandmother. You know the rest of the story. I moved to Fayetteville to get a teaching job. I won't be here long. so I'm telling you about it now, years later. I don't want to go to the Creator with this secret on my conscience. Every day since then, I have walked the streets expecting the dire consequences of my involvement. That was the main reason I went to war. Being involved in 2 murders is a burden you carry for the rest of your life. It doesn't matter if I pulled the trigger or not. In the eyes of the law or the authorities, it makes me equally guilty. For the sake of your soul, be a good person and live a good life. Then your end will be peaceful. God bless you, and thank you for helping an old, frightened man find peace. As a traveler passing through Texas, I had heard stories of its vast landscapes and hospitable people. But what I didn't know was that my journey would take a terrible turn and lead me to a nightmare that would haunt my dreams forever. On a hot summer evening, I was driving down a deserted Texas highway. The sun was setting, creating eerie reflections on the plain. The silence around me was frightening, and a sense of unease was building in me. After a few miles, I noticed a figure on the side of the road, a hitchhiker with an outstretched thumb frantically looking for a hitchhiker. Against my better judgment, I decided to give him a ride in hopes of helping him on his journey. The stranger got into my car and politely thanked me. He seemed friendly enough, but there was something in his eyes that hinted at an underlying darkness. I dismissed the concern and wrote it off as an overactive imagination. As we traveled deeper into Texas, the landscape became increasingly desolate and towns became sparse. A sense of isolation gripped us and we were out of breath. The behavior of the hitchhikers became increasingly bizarre. Their conversations took on a mystical tone. They spoke of forgotten places and ancient secrets buried in the Texas soil. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the nature of my journey. Dawn had come, and the world was plunged into darkness. The road ahead was endless, and the only source of light was the faint glow of my car's headlights. With each passing mile, it seemed that I was sinking deeper into the unknown. Suddenly, I saw a figure crossing the road. I braked sharply, my heart racing. But when my headlights illuminated the empty road, the mysterious figure was nowhere to be seen. I had a doubt in my mind. Had I gone crazy, or was something sinister lurking in the shadows of the Texas night? I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that danger lurked beyond our senses, and with each mile the true nature of these hitchhikers became clearer. Their stories became more and more mysterious and terrifying. This is the story of a secret cult living in the heart of Texas and performing unspeakable rituals under the cover of darkness. Fear gripped my heart as I realized the gravity of the situation. Without realizing it, I was caught in a dark web, a pawn in a sinister game that I had no hope of winning. Despair seized me, and I thought of escape. All the roads seemed to lead nowhere, and the towns I passed through were deserted and silent. The vastness of Texas had become a prison for me, the endless land sucking me into a nightmare. The hitchhikers' behavior became increasingly hostile, and their intentions were far worse than I could have imagined. Their words were venomous and promised us both a fate worse than death. In a moment of terror, I made a split-second decision. I turned off the main road and headed into the darkness of the Texas desert, while my traveling companions screamed in protest, their voices echoing menacingly in my ears. I drove for what seemed like an eternity, my heart pounding frantically as I crossed treacherous terrain. The night seemed to last forever, and darkness burned everything in its path. But just as hope began to fade, I saw a faint light on the horizon. I came across a small town, a sign of civilization in the middle of the desert. I had escaped the clutches of hitchhikers and their devious plans, but the nightmare was not over. The events of that fateful night scarred me deeply and locked me forever in the darkness that lives in the heart of Texas. The memories of that encounter are a chilling reminder of the evil that lurks in unexpected places. So as I continue on my journey, I carry the weight of that experience as a warning imprinted into my being. It is a reminder that once charming Texas now has a sinister side, and that even the most beautiful landscapes hide deep fears. Wherever you travel, always be on your guard, The shadows lurking in the shadow of the Texas sun are a reminder that true fear knows no boundaries and can creep into the mind of the unsuspecting traveler. No matter how wonderful our lives may seem, an invisible force always comes along and knocks us out, sometimes forever. Whether we give birth to 2.5 children in a nuclear family, live with our parents at age 45, or live a lonely and childless life in a cell, no one can predict our future. Perhaps the best way to illustrate my point is through the story of my former best friend, Darren Sellers. No matter where he grew up, in Dallas or in the small country town he was destined to grow up in, Darren was always a special kid, a doctor, a lawyer, a professional soccer player. He could excel in any profession. From an early age, he was always ahead of his peers in everything. He started talking at an unusually early age, and by the age of 4, he could read and write. I wouldn't be surprised if he came out of his mother's womb toilet trained. I think you understand. He was a special boy. Something wonderful was going to happen to him. But it didn't. In high school, he began to exhibit disturbing traits. The hobby he and I had always enjoyed, collecting and cataloging the skulls and horns of dead animals, soon turned into killing and skinning neighborhood pets. I found this aspect of the hobby odd, but not enough to affect our friendship. However, I was impressed with the way he treated his girlfriend. Growing up in a very small town, we had known most of the girls since kindergarten. He had close friends, too. Anyway, he was popular and could pick any girl he wanted. It didn't matter what kind of girl it was, but if Darren decided to date her, he was always treated badly. A serious relationship meant nothing to him. A few really nice girls had lost their hearts to Darren, but truth be told, they were lucky. Sarah was a very smart and beautiful girl who dated Darren for several years straight. Darren would beat her up, she would break up with him, apologize, and go back to him. Not a week went by that she didn't berate Darren for his behavior, but it didn't change anything. It was as if an alien spirit had taken over his body and began to overshadow the man I'd grown up with. It had no effect on his performance in school. He graduated at the top of his class and went to Texas A&M University. I did very well academically, ranking 6th in a class of 100, but I needed a scholarship if I wanted to go to college. After deciding on UT Austin, Darren and I went our separate ways and didn't see each other for about 2 years, but when we finally met and reconnected, everything changed. I didn't go home for the first year. Money was much more important to me, and there wasn't much holding me back when I wasn't working. I only spoke to Darren a few times, and in those conversations he never mentioned the problems with A&M. However, when I spoke to my parents on the phone before the Christmas break of my sophomore year, my mom told me that Darren had dropped out of university and had come home a month ago. I had planned to visit him for a week during the vacation, and now I had a lot of questions I wanted to ask him. We met the first night in town and drove to Dallas to visit some clubs. I decided not to ask Darren too many questions. He could tell me himself if he wanted to. At the first club, Darren finally told me about his time in College Station. Things were going well for a while, but then he started smoking and stopped attending classes. He had a hard time making friends because of the anonymity of all the strangers. The few people he met led him down a dark path. According to him, as early as his sophomore year, he realized that he had reached his limit and dropped out to avoid expulsion. He was a completely different person than the one who had dropped out of school just 18 months earlier. He still looked the same, except for the goatee and long hair, but now he didn't seem to care what happened to him. I had won an A&M scholarship and was now delivering pizzas. On the way to my next stop, he offered to take the girls and have some fun. I laughed at first, thinking he meant catching prostitutes or something. I said, "Yeah, sure, save your money, thanks." Obviously, I misunderstood what he meant. He said, "Let's pick up a girl on the street and take turns playing with her." I was shocked at such a suggestion. I gazed into his face, trying to find any sign that he was joking, but I couldn't. For a few minutes, nothing was said between us. I still couldn't believe what he'd said, and then a strange thought struck me. Hadn't he done something like this before? He hesitated at first, but finally admitted that he had done it a few times with a friend at university. Maybe he took it less seriously, but he emphasized that he had never hurt a girl. Having had their fun, they would leave him and move on. I almost collapsed in disgust at that moment, but I pulled myself together, and then I remembered, I wasn't going to participate in this. My words were meant to diffuse any hostile feelings he might have had at that moment. All I could think about was getting away from him. I pretended to be uncomfortable and offered to go home. He didn't seem angry about it. I avoided his calls for the rest of the week and returned to Austin on Friday. At the end of the school year, we decided to talk again. He was worried about whether I'd be back for summer vacation, and I told him I had a lot of work to do and didn't know when I'd be back. I wasn't lying. He had to work almost every day if he wanted to pay for school. Honestly, that night I thought our friendship was over. Something that had always lurked beneath the surface of his personality had been exposed while at A&M, and now he had no control over it. When he joined us at games, he was no longer the friend I knew. Shortly after that last phone conversation, my mom sent me a letter with a newspaper article. It didn't name the perpetrator, but later my mom told me it was Darren. I guess when he realized I wasn't coming back anytime soon, he went hunting on his own and got caught. Perhaps the most tragic part of this story is that the woman lost her life. Without the support of university friends, he was unable to control his victim, and at least as far as we know, went further than he should have. Because of the seriousness of the charges, he has been held in the Collin County Jail for several years without the possibility of bail. Unless the police are mistaken, this case will likely be open and shut. That means she will spend at least 30 years in prison. For the sake of all the women in the world, let's hope she is not released. Thank you for watching, my dear friend.